This is part 4 of Unit 3. Starting at the first part of this lecture is going to be dealing with kind of what it just says here on the board. Let's take a look at what life is like, or what America is like in 1800. That's kind of a big year. The Constitution has been around and in play for over a decade. We'd have 2 presidents, Washington and Adams. And so let's kind of just get a snapshot of what America is at this time. First of all, it's still a very new nation. It's weak. It doesn't have a big army. It has a huge border to defend. In other words, if there was someone that wanted to invade us, we'd have a hard time defending ourselves. We're also weak internally. We're still thinking of ourselves as independent states more than a unified country. There is some unity, but not as much maybe as we need. So we're kind of fragile. We're struggling. It's, think of it as a newborn baby. That's just not newborn baby, but a toddler that's just starting to walk. It's struggling. It can fall anytime, and that's what America is. It's still solving a lot of their problems. Most of the people live on farms. It's a very rural population. We're talking somewhere to the neighborhoods of almost 90% probably at this time, if not certainly in the 80s. Most people live on farms, and most of them live on small farms. We have this idea that everyone that was a farmer had these big plantations. That's not true at all. Most of the people have very small tracts of land that's just a family farm. Just the dad and maybe a couple of the sons worked, with 1 or 2 animals. So it's a very rural population. The economy still revolves primarily around selling resources, which we mean by crops, tobacco, rice, in particular still. Timber would also be a big resource that we're selling. In 1793, though, some things are going to start to change. Eli Whitney invents something called the cotton gin. The cotton gin is a machine that separates the little seeds that are in the cotton plant from the actual cotton. What that does is it creates a great demand for cotton. Separating those seeds was something you had to do by hand. It was very painstaking. It took a lot of time. And when the cotton gin is invented, you can do it so much faster that cotton becomes very, very profitable. It's a huge money maker. And so more and more land gets taken from tobacco and put into cotton. Tobacco also really depletes the soil a lot, so they changed to cotton. What's important to note about this is cotton then becomes king. Most of the farms in the south then start planting cotton. You have to have a warmer climate for that. So it's the southern farms and plantations that plant cotton and start to expand even more, because cotton just makes you so much money. It's so profitable. So we call that king cotton. And that's important too, because that's going to kind of revive slavery. One of the popular beliefs by a lot of the people in the North that didn't like slavery, people like Ben Franklin and John Dickinson and some of the people in the North that were some of the people that wrote the Constitution and were around for the Declaration of Independence and things, said we don't need to worry about slavery. Slavery will kill itself. It's going to slowly die out. And they were being proven right. You couldn't bring in any more slaves, and slavery was just slowly dying away. It just wasn't as much need for it. But then when cotton takes off, when Eli Whitney invents this cotton gin, the demand for cotton worldwide soars so much that it kind of revives slavery, and slavery is going to start to grow again. So that's something to put in the back of your mind as well. America in 1800, the population was rapidly growing. We have a lot of immigrants. We also have more people surviving. Our infant mortality rate isn't as bad as it was. So we're growing. We're expanding as well. We're growing further and further west. As you can see here, we have the first 2 new states being added, Kentucky and Tennessee. We're also going to expand south eventually as well. European wars primarily between France and England and Spain and Dutch and Russia as well, led the U.S. to grow economically, because we now became kind of what I like to call the UPS of the day. We were the ones that shipped stuff all over the world. We became specialists in that because we were neutral, remember. George Washington said, let's be neutral. So we are going to be the ones that are going to be shipping the stuff. Like I said, I like to think of it as kind of the FedEx or the UPS of the time. We're going to transport stuff. We become expert shipbuilders. That's a big part of the economy in New England. And that's important to know because that's going to play into some future events. The third president of the United States, the next one we're going to talk about is TJ, or Thomas Jefferson. We remember he wrote the Declaration of Independence primarily. He also was in France as a diplomat and served as the first Secretary of State under George Washington. So let's talk about his presidency a little bit. First of all, he gets elected in 1800, and this election is sometimes called the Revolution of 1800. And why it's called that? Because it was the first time in our history, and one of the first times in world history, that you had power going from one group to another peacefully. Remember, we had the Federalists. That's what Washington and John Adams were. They lose in 1800, and power goes to the Anti-Federalists, which are basically called the Republicans, or the Democratic Republicans, Thomas Jefferson's party. That's why it's called a revolution. We have that peaceful transfer of power. The other thing to note about the election of 1800 is we're slowly getting more and more people involved, not only with voting but with politics. Now that you have choices, you have debate, and you have discussion. It's not, it's easy to pick George Washington, okay? But now when you have, in 1800 it was John Adams, who's pretty famous, has done a lot of good things, and you have Thomas Jefferson. There's a lot of debate, and that's getting more and more people involved with politics, okay? And that's something to know as well, put in the back of your mind. An interesting thing that happens with this election that they didn't foresee, when they first elected the president, the process first started, basically whoever got the most votes was president, whoever got the second most votes was vice president. Well, because now we have two political parties, what ended up happening is people split their votes along party lines. So in those days, you voted twice. Okay, you voted for president and you voted for vice president, and whoever got the most votes, again, wins. Well, because people were split along party lines, I'm going to vote twice for the Democratic Republicans. In this case, it was Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. So what ends up happening is those two guys tie, because I get two votes. I vote for one guy in my party, I vote for the other guy in my party. So they tied. And that was totally unexpected. Everybody, knew that Thomas Jefferson was who they wanted to be president, but Aaron Burr got the same amount of votes because nobody broke party and voted for John Adams or anybody else. So there's this tie. So how do we solve that? Well, eventually Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr worked it out so that Jefferson could become president. And anyway, this leads us to the 12th Amendment, which basically means that the president and the vice president now are one ticket. You just vote once, and you're voting for both guys at the same time, just like we have today. So that was kind of interesting that came out of that. Thomas Jefferson, when he took office of the president, he wanted to break from the past. He thought Washington and Adams had spent way too much money, were too hoity-toity, and so he wanted to break from that. So like when he gave his first inaugural address, which is the speech you give when you become president and get sworn in, when he gave that first speech, he had a very plain outfit. He didn't ride in a fancy carriage there. He didn't want people, thinking too highly of him. It was often said that he would greet you at the front door of the White House, which we have the White House now. The Capitol's moved to Washington, D.C., and we have the White House. He would greet you at the door himself, and often even in his pajamas, and he'd have his robe on and his slippers. He was very informal. He wanted the office of presidency to be something for the common man, or represent the common person, not like I'm a king or really anyone more special than you. So he wanted to break from the excesses of the past. When you think Thomas Jefferson, one idea to keep in the back of your head that's connected to him very tightly is this idea of the yeoman farmer, the very small farmer that works the land with himself and his family, very simple people. These are the ideal people to Thomas Jefferson. These people live simply, but they're hardworking. They're not greatly educated in terms of book knowledge, but they know right from wrong. They know how the world works. They have great common sense. That's what Thomas Jefferson wanted the country to be. If people were like these simple farmers, our country would be great, because we wouldn't be greedy, we wouldn't be fighting all the time, because we'd all have what we need, we'd all be very satisfied with what we have. And that was his idea of what America should be. That's his ideal dream of a nation of these yeoman farmers, where everybody kind of just has these small little communities, they work together. So remember, Jefferson wants a rural country, a country where people are small-time farmers with very, community-oriented feelings and common sense, hard work, religious people kind of thing. Thomas Jefferson has something amazing happening in his presidency. That's the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon is fighting wars, as you probably know, and he needs money, as wars are expensive, as we know. So he agrees to sell some land to the United States, the Louisiana Purchase, and this is basically going to double the size of our country. Interesting enough about the Louisiana Purchase is, remember the idea of the elastic clause or necessary and proper clause, and how the people like Jefferson and the Anti-Federalists said that gives the government too much power? Well, there's nowhere in the Constitution that says the government can buy land. And Jefferson's really bothered by this. He advocated that, you can't do that. You have to have a very strict view of the Constitution, which Jefferson believed in. You can only do what the Constitution gives you the power to do. But the opportunity to double the size of the United States, to buy this land fairly cheap, is just too good to pass up. And so he's torn. On one hand, do I stick true to my principles? This is what I believe in. This is what I've based my life on, that we can only do what's written in the Constitution, or do I take advantage of this great opportunity? And of course, you know that he takes advantage of it. He sends out Lewis and Clark to explore and discover, and you guys are very familiar with that because we celebrate it a lot in our classrooms here. So we kind of know that he does that, but what I want you to know is that it created this confliction or controversy, and of course Jefferson gets slammed by his opponents, the Federalists, hammer him saying, oh, you're just a big liar, you say one thing and do another. So that's kind of important to know. Another important thing to remember about Thomas Jefferson's presidency is a Supreme Court case called Marbury versus Madison. Marbury versus Madison establishes something called judicial review, the policy of judicial review. Basically, what that means, it gives the Supreme Court the power to strike down laws or say they're unconstitutional. Okay? The Supreme Court can basically eliminate a law, say that it violates the Constitution. This is the first time they did that, and of course that's a very important precedent that needed to be set. It establishes that the Supreme Court is a truly equal branch of the government that has the power to check and balance in this way, and of course that's been used many, many, many times over in our history. So that court case is extremely important because it establishes that power. John Marshall is the leader of the Supreme Court. He's the Chief Justice at the time, and he's kind of important to know and tied to Thomas Jefferson too, because his Supreme Court, under his leadership, a lot of the cases they hear, they side with the federal government instead of the states, and so it strengthens the idea that the national government or their laws or their policies supersede or are above the states. So what I'm saying is, whenever there's a law, like the states have this law and the national government says this, those two laws conflict. Marshall's Supreme Court is going to side with the national government. They're giving the government more power all the time, and the states are losing power. Something to remember as well. And that is Thomas Jefferson. There's lots of things, of course, that he did other than that, but those are the things that you need to remember about our third president the most. Okay. Our last part then, we'll talk about the fourth president, which is James Madison, and the fifth president, who is Monroe.